We are here with Matthew Carter, one of the few people I know who has his own Wikipedia page. And this, again, I have no written questions. What I've decided to do is essentially go through your Wikipedia page.
I hope it's accurate.
We're going to find
I haven't
out.
looked at it myself.
You were born in England, and as you were growing up, it was the time of the Blitz in England. Do you have any memory of that?
Yes. I do remember bomb craters in the street. I remember the contrails of
German points?
yeah, I don't know exactly what they were, but you know, dogfights. I remember being warned not to pick up any interesting looking thing that might be in the garden, because it was probably an incendiary bomb. And I remember my grandmother's house having all its windows blown out by a doodle bug which landed in the woods and so on. So yeah, I remember. I remember the feeling that there were people actually trying to kill me and my mum in our own home.
Because your father was away during most of the war.
Most of the war, yes. Yes.
So when did you realize what he did?
What an interesting question. I have no idea. You know, my dad was not a very anecdotal person. He didn't sort of bring his work home. When he was home, he was in the garden. He was a keen gardener. So he didn't talk about his work at all, really. So I guess it was just a gradual process of osmosis. I mean, he had books, of course, at home, which told me what his interests were and so on, and were very interesting to me in time as well. But I don't remember a sort of lightning bolt moment of thinking, oh my God, my dad's a typographer or something like that. It must have been gradual. Yeah.
I would assume that your education was mostly traditional.
Yeah.
Lower school, learned reading and writing, into what we call high school,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went to college.
No,
So you had no post-secondary education after that.
no.
So you were then apprenticed to a company in Amsterdam?
In Haarlem, in the Netherlands, yeah. I left school in 55 in the summer, and then in September I started this, we didn't actually use the term intern in those days, but unpaid trainee at Enschede's. And they had this, this project of welcoming John Miles, a very old friend of mine, was the first person, I think, to do that. And then I came, and Carl Dare from Canada followed. So it was a great scheme that they had, and Enschede's was a very fascinating place. They're primarily security printers. They print stamps and banknotes and so on, but also general printers. And they had their own type foundry, at least when I was there. And you know, I was supposed to work my way around the whole factory, but I started in the type foundry, and I really sort of stuck there the whole year, working with Paul Radish, the punch cutter, learning a completely obsolescent trade, obsolete, I should say, trade. But I enjoyed that, and it's true, I was supposed to go to university at Oxford, but when I went back after that intermediate year, I couldn't face going back into academic life. I expected a problem with my parents, because my dad was very academic. But to my relief, they had no problem with my dropping out of Oxford before I began. I guess it saved them the fees. So then I kind of started trying to work. Yeah.
So this introduced you to the world of type.
Yes.
You had no knowledge before that.
Well, as I say, my dad had all the books, well, not all the books, but a lot of books about type. And I was interested enough in that. And at school, I got caught up in the revival of italic handwriting. And indeed, I taught it for a while. This is my second school, public school as it's called, private school in other words. And so I taught italic handwriting. And so my dad did give me a copy of Edward Johnston's Writing and Illuminating and Lettering, which, as you know, is called the best manual on any subject ever written.
We have a copy in the library.
I'm sure you do. It would be serious if you didn't. So I studied that, and you know, I did get, you know, as a schoolboy, I was interested in that, and I drew some lettering for the school magazine and so on. So I sort of, you know, I kind of worked my way into it gradually.
Yeah, I'm just trying to probe how it all began.
Yeah.
So we have these interesting confluences
Yes.
of you coming together with type. So now you're in Harlem, and
Yes.
you've learned hot metal. Did you ever make a punch?
Oh, yes. I did a few. I did some for the University Press at Oxford. I did a couple for Hans Mardersdijk, but I don't think he used them. I did more than punches. I cut binders brasses, which was a very similar thing, and there was more demand for that. Because, you know, once you cut the brass, you can use it for binding. But if you cut a punch, you've then got to make a matrix and cast type and so on. It's a more elaborate process. But yeah, so I did a number of engraving jobs of one kind or another. But you know, I mean, I learned to make type before I could design it, but I quickly realized I had to learn to design it because commissions for cutting punches or brasses and so on were very few and far between.
And how many years did you do that?
Well, I came back from Holland in '56, and I worked at my parents' home for a couple of years, and then in '58 I moved to London, and in 1960 I came on a visit to this country, which changed my life completely. So, but, you know, really from when I got back from Harlem in '56, I was trying to earn a living, doing lettering and anything I could find.
So you're now in the U.S. Who do you visit?
Everybody. It was wonderful. This was the sort of late spring, early summer of 1960. I got handed around, you know. I was at Pushpin and Shemaev and Geisler, and Sadler, Hennessy and Leballin and everyone. And of course I went to Mergenthaler and kind of fell in love.
And who took you around at Mergenthaler?
Well, Mike Barker, principally. I mean, Mike had, I knew Mike. I'd met him in England because before he went to work at Mergenthaler, he had had a year's fellowship at the Plant and Apparatus Museum in Antwerp, doing a huge amount of work in cataloguing this astonishing collection of 16th century typographic material which survives there miraculously, and photographing it and so on.
Yeah.
Then when he came back, I think in '59, he went to work at Linotype as Jackson Burke's assistant. Jackson was the director of typographic development. So Mike worked with him. And when I got there in '60, I spent a lot of time with Mike, and it was he who showed me around.
And the immensity of that building and all the things that were happening there. And the
Yeah.
letter drawing office was gigantic at that time.
Yes, yeah. It really fired my imagination, and they were all very kind to me. I mean, Jackson was incredibly kind to me, and I mean, you know, people talk rather glibly about culture shock now, but boy, did I have a case of that when I got to New York. You know, I'd grown up in a sort of rather cozy situation because of my dad's contacts and so on. You know, I knew Stanley Morrison, I knew Beatrice Ward, I knew Jan van Krimpen, I knew all these people, and I thought I knew everything, you know. I got to New York, realized I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. I had to start over. So that was a shock. And I think my first reaction was rather cowardly. I thought I'll just go back home with my tail between my legs and pretend none of this happened, but I really couldn't sort of do that. But I did, you know, I sort of let Jackson and Mike know that I would love to work there, but actually it was a blessing in disguise. There wasn't a place for me there then, and I think that was a very good thing because I really had nothing to offer at that point. But 5 years later, I had done some things in London that did sort of equip me for the Mergenthaler experience. Yes.
And how did they approach you to retain you?
At Mergenthaler?
Yeah.
Well, I'd kept in touch with Mike, and Mike would periodically come to London on Linotype business. And he would come and stay with me in my flat, and the Linotype people were horrified because they thought he was consorting with the enemy, which he was, because I was working for Photon, Linotype, who were Linotype's competition in the photo composing world. But Mike and I, those of you who knew Mike, he liked to talk, and so we had a lot of discussions in those visits to London of his about the possibility of my going to Mergenthaler, and indeed what I would do when I got there. So when Jackson retired in, I think, 63, fairly soon after that, the conversations got a little bit more pointed, you know, and we really were working towards my actually going there. This wasn't just an idea, we were actively planning that. And so in the fall of 65, it happened, and I moved to Brooklyn. Yeah. I should say, you know, this is occasionally you know, I'm having pleasant recollections of this. I should say how it is that Mike got the job of being Director of Typographic Development. Here's what happened. You know, Jackson, who had had this job for a long time, had to go into hospital. I can't remember exactly why. And he knew he was going to be out for a while to recover and so on. So, of course, he told his boss, Jack Keller, that he was going to be out. That's it. But meanwhile, he had privately decided not to come back. He didn't tell his boss that. So, of course, when Jackson went into hospital, Mike started picking up all the work, you know. I mean, anyone who had questions with Jackson just came to Mike. So as the weeks went by, Mike started doing the work. And so when Jackson finally did say to Jack Keller, I'm not coming back, I'm retiring, they said, hey, Mike's been doing the job, he might as well have the title in the office, you know. I think if Jackson had not done that sort of subterfuge, they would have thought that Mike was too junior. He had been there 3-4 years or something. They would have gone into the newspaper trade, hired someone, and we never would have had Helvetica. You know?
Well, actually, there's a story there. Mike did not have the title that Jackson Burke had. His title was type designer, and they paid him less than they paid Jackson Burke. It was very controversial at the time, by the way, because I was on the inside.
Yes.
And it was
when did you get to Mergenthaler?
in '59.
Aha.
I graduated high school in June,
Yes.
and I went to my guidance counselor and I said, I need a job. And he said, oh, there's this company Mergenthaler. I said, what do they do? He said, something to do with books. I said, sounds interesting. He says, when you go, take Bernie with you. He needs a job too. I went to high school with Bernie Sanders. And I got the job and he didn't. And it was in the shipping department. But then I worked my way up through mailboy, clerk, and I heard
you were
everything.
mailboy when I arrived.
That's correct.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so you came on my radar because you had a cubicle on the 8th floor, I think.
Yes, this was a really, really nice office. it was a corner office, and it was carved out of the steno pool and the filing department, beyond which was the order department, and the mail room, by the way, on the side. And it was a very nice office, and Mike and I found some old furniture in a warehouse that we used in my office. And it was there only a couple of months after I arrived. You know, when I got there, I worked all hours every weekend. I stayed with the Parkers, and I didn't find an apartment for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks because I didn't have a single day off to look for an apartment. We just worked the whole time. So I was working one evening, about this time of year, I think it was actually the 9th of November, when the lights went out. I thought, oh crap, you know, a fuse was blown or something. So I looked around, and the building seemed to be kind of dark, and I looked out of the window, and the Navy Yard down below was dark. And I looked over to Manhattan, Midtown, dark, and I thought, hello, this is not a fuse, you know. this was the famous blackout of the whole Northeast. Went down as far as Maryland, I think, and Ontario in Canada. Caused by what was called cascading of the electrical grid. You know, one unit failed, that overloaded the next one, for that failed, and cascade. The typeface I was working on when the lights went out, we didn't have a name for it at the time, so it's called Cascade. And if you can find, you know, naming typefaces is a lot harder than designing them. So if one falls into your lap like that, you're very grateful.
Well, you can copyright the name. You can't protect the typeface. That's the problem in America.
Don't get me started on this.
So you came on my radar
Yeah.
when I noticed that people were going into your office with these big sheets.
Yes,
And I had no idea what this was. I knew these were from the letter drawing office.
yes.
And so what did you do? What were they asking you to do?
I never made these drawings. These are what are
No,
called,
you didn't make them, but they would ask you questions about them.
God knows.
Really?
what they asked.
Okay, that's
Yes,
interesting.
No, you know, these were produced by the letter drawing department at Mergenthaler and had been in that form. Not exactly from the foundation of the company, because we once found some of the original drawings.
We have all the original ones here,
You
by
do.
the way, and
You do.
they're similar but not the same.
Yeah. And these, you know, they're like engineering blueprints, they're dimensioned and so on. In the intervening time between my visit to New York in 1960 and my going there to work in 65, part of the time I had spent working at Crossfield Electronics in London, who were the manufacturing agents in Britain for the photon machine, Linotype so-called in Europe. They made the machines, but all the fonts were made in Paris at Romano, which meant, happily for me, I spent about a week out of every month in Paris. And got to meet and know well Adrian Frutiger and all the other designers in the office. And they were not drawing like this, they were drawing positive. I mean, these are all wrong reading as required in the factory. At Romano, we drew right reading, and we drew at a sort of reasonable scale. Maybe caps were 5 inches high, you know, or 4 or 5 inches high. And originally we used scratchboard, but that's not a very good medium, it's not very stable. So eventually we discovered a Mylar drafting film. So when I, you know, in these preliminary conversations I had with Mike, I said, I'm not going to make these things, you know, because I'd become very familiar with them. So Mike explored in the grid making department, where they had a number of cameras, specially built cameras. They were very beautiful things. They were built on a granite slab to be dimensionally stable. And they found one that had been made for a certain purpose, but it was no longer in use. And it was too big to get rid of, you know, so it was sitting there in a corner. So Mike figured out what the ratio was, you know, between the object and the end of it, what the lens was in other words. And so we did a little math, and we came up with a drawing scale so we could use this camera which was standing idle, to make the plaques. I don't know if you've got a plaque there, perhaps not. This was a sort of intermediate thing in making linofilm grids. So I was able to continue to draw black ink on mylar drafting film from the minute I got to Brooklyn, to Mergenthaler, to my huge relief, because I didn't want to work in this way. And also, the drawing office was, of course, a union shop, and the letter drawers were only allowed to do 2 drawings a day, whether they were double F ligatures or whether one was a period and one was a colon. That was the day's work, you know. So that was rather limiting, in a way. So I walked into a very agreeable, amenable, congenial situation at Ryerson Street, which had really, in a way, been constructed in my honour, because, as I say, no one had worked in that way before. But it was quicker and more direct for photo composition, certainly. Yeah.
So from these drawings, they would trace them in a pantograph, and they would create a pattern plate. And by the way, we found 3 pattern plates in the black boxes, and they were MOP, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Then, when they did this, they would trace it in another pantograph, and they would produce the punch. And that's what made the matrices, which ran in the Linotype machine.